Jack Bartlett had survived blizzards that buried the ranch under 3 feet of snow. He had buried people he loved. He had watched the land crack and flood and heal itself again. But on this quiet Tuesday morning at Heartland, the hardest thing Jack Bartlett had ever done was walk past his granddaughter, Amy, at the breakfast table without saying a single word. Amy looked up from her coffee the moment she heard his boots on the kitchen floor. She knew that sound better than she knew anything else in this world. Those slow, heavy steps had always meant safety to her. When she was little, she used to run toward that sound. But this morning, she sat perfectly still and watched him cross the kitchen, pour himself a cup of coffee, and walk right back out the door like she wasn't even there. She opened her mouth. His name was right there on her lips. Jack. The screen door closed behind him. Amy set her coffee mug down on the table very slowly. Her hands were steady, but her chest felt like someone had reached in and squeezed. The kitchen was warm. The morning light was coming through the window the way it always did. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. But nothing felt the same at all. Something had broken the night before, and neither one of them knew yet how to fix it. The night before had been one of those rare evenings when the whole family was together. Lou had made her famous pot roast. Lisa had brought a bottle of wine from her vineyard. Tim had actually shown up on time, which everyone treated as a small miracle. Lindy had been running around the kitchen in her socks, sliding on the hardwood floors and making Jack laugh in that quiet way he had, where his whole face softened and the years seemed to fall right off him. It had been a good evening, right up until it wasn't. Amy had waited until everyone was settled, until the plates were full and the conversation was easy. She had told herself all week that she would bring it up calmly, that she would lay out her reasons clearly, that she would make Jack understand before he had a chance to react. But the moment the words left her mouth, she knew she had read the room wrong. "I've decided to sell the east pasture." The table went quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet that settles over a family after a good meal. This was a sharp, sudden quiet, the kind that comes right before something shifts. Lou stopped mid-reach for the bread basket. Tim looked up from his plate. Lisa set her wine glass down with the careful precision of someone who already sensed trouble coming, and Jack put down his fork. He didn't yell. That wasn't Jack's way. He simply looked at Amy across the table with those sharp blue eyes of his and said, very quietly, "That land has been in this family for 60 years, Amy." Amy had prepared for this. She had her answer ready. She explained that the east pasture hadn't been properly used in over 2 years, that the maintenance costs were eating into the ranch's budget, that she had spoken to a developer who wanted to turn it into an equine therapy center, which meant horses would still be on that land. She had thought it through from every angle. She had done the numbers 3 times, but Jack wasn't listening to the numbers. "You should have talked to me first," he said. "I'm talking to you now," Amy said. No. Jack pushed his chair back from the table and stood up. "You made your decision already. This isn't a conversation. You're just telling me what you've done." Amy opened her mouth to argue, but Lou put a hand on her arm under the table. A small, firm pressure. "Not now," it said. "Let it go for tonight." Amy let it go. But Jack didn't. He said goodnight to everyone, kissed Lindy on the top of her head, gave Lisa a quiet look that carried a whole conversation inside it, and walked out of the dining room. His bedroom door didn't slam. It closed with a soft, final click that somehow felt louder than any slam could have. Now, the morning after, Amy sat alone at the kitchen table and replayed it all in her head. She kept looking for the moment she had done something wrong. She had thought about the ranch. She had thought about the future. She had made a practical decision about land that hadn't been earning its keep. But as she sat there in the quiet morning kitchen, she started to wonder if maybe she hadn't thought about Jack enough. The east pasture wasn't just land to him. She knew that. She had always known that. It was the pasture where he had taught her mother Marian to ride. It was the pasture where Amy herself had taken her first solo gallop, with Jack watching from the fence, trying very hard to look calm when he was anything but. That land held memories that couldn't be put into a spreadsheet or a budget report. Amy wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and stared at the table. She hadn't been wrong about the numbers, but Jack hadn't been wrong about the meaning. And somewhere in the middle of those two truths, the two of them had gotten lost. Nobody at Heartland ever truly slept when something was wrong. The ranch had a way of holding tension in its walls, in its floorboards, in the very air that moved through it. And Lou Fleming had always been the most sensitive to it. She was up before 6 that morning, standing at the kitchen sink with a half-empty coffee mug, staring out the window at the frost still sitting on the grass. She had heard Amy moving around in her room the night before. Slow, restless footsteps, the kind that only happen when a person is too tired to sleep and too wound up to stop thinking. Lou had pressed her ear to the wall between their rooms for just a moment, the way she used to do when they were teenagers. She had heard nothing, just silence. And somehow the silence was worse than tears would have been. When Amy finally came downstairs that morning, Lou didn't say anything right away. She just poured her sister a fresh coffee without being asked and slid it across the counter. That was its own kind of language between them, a language they had been speaking since they were girls. It meant, "I already know something is wrong. You don't have to explain it yet." Amy sat down and wrapped her hands around the mug. Lou leaned against the counter and waited, outside. Through the kitchen window, they could both see Jack. He was out by the fence at the edge of the yard, doing absolutely nothing except standing there with his hands resting on the top rail, looking out toward the fields. He had his old green jacket on, the one Lisa kept threatening to throw away and he kept rescuing from the donation pile. He stood so still he could have been part of the landscape. Lou watched him for a long moment before she spoke. "How bad was it last night?" she asked. After everyone left, Amy stared into her coffee. "We didn't fight, if that's what you're asking. There was nothing left to fight about. He just went to his room and that was it." "And this morning?" Amy didn't answer right away. She traced the rim of her mug with one finger. "He walked past me like I was furniture, Lou." Lou felt that land somewhere behind her ribs. She knew Jack's silences better than most people. She had grown up inside them. There were silences that meant he was thinking. Silences that meant he was tired. Silences that meant he was moved by something and didn't have words for it yet. But there was one specific silence that Jack Bartlett only used when he felt truly hurt. Not angry, hurt. And that silence was different from all the others because it didn't have a visible end to it. Lou was starting to think this was that silence. "Amy, can I ask you something honestly?" Lou said, setting her own mug down. "You're going to ask it either way," Amy said, which was fair. "Did you make the decision about the East pasture before that dinner? Or were you genuinely asking everyone for their thoughts?" The pause that followed was just a little too long. Amy looked up from her coffee and met Lou's eyes. And in that look was the answer neither of them needed to say out loud. The decision had already been made. The dinner had been Amy's way of letting the family know, not a real conversation. And somewhere in that distinction was the root of everything. Lou didn't push it. She wasn't there to make Amy feel worse than she already did. But she turned back to the window and looked at Jack again, still standing at that fence, still staring out at those fields with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. She thought about something their mother Marion used to say. She used to say that Jack Bartlett never argued about the thing that was actually bothering him. He argued about the thing sitting right next to it. And if you wanted to understand Jack, you had to look past the surface argument and find what was living underneath it. Lou let her mind move slowly over the situation. The way you'd move a hand over grass looking for something small and hidden, the East pasture. 60 years in the family, the place where Marion had learned to ride. And suddenly Lou understood something that Amy hadn't seen yet. This wasn't about the land being sold. Not really. Jack could have been talked around to the idea eventually, given enough time and the right conversation. He was stubborn, but he wasn't unreasonable. No. What had actually broken something in Jack last night was the moment he realized that Amy had made a decision that touched the deepest part of their shared history and hadn't felt the need to bring him into it first. To Jack, that didn't feel like practicality. It felt like being pushed to the outside edge of his own family. And for a man who had spent his entire life being the steady center of everything and everyone at Heartland, being pushed to the outside edge was the loneliest feeling in the world. That was something Amy had known her whole life. There was a specific kind of stillness that settled over Heartland in that window between the last hour of darkness and the first pale light of morning. The horses shifted softly in their stalls. The wood breathed. The smell of hay and leather and cold morning air wrapped around everything like something warm. Amy had always loved that hour more than any other. It was the one time of day when the world hadn't started asking anything of her yet. She had been coming to the barn at this hour more and more lately. Ever since Ty, the barn had become the place she went when the house felt too full of his absence. When she walked through the kitchen and her body still expected to find him there, leaning against the counter with that quiet smile of his, she would pull on her boots and walk through the dark yard to the barn instead. The horses never looked at her with worry in their eyes. They just made room for her. And sometimes that was exactly what she needed. This particular morning she had arrived even earlier than usual. She hadn't slept at all. She had lain in bed for hours watching the ceiling, going over the same thoughts in the same circles until they were grooves in her mind. She had thought about the east pasture, about the dinner table, about Jack's face when he pushed his chair back and stood up, about the way his bedroom door had closed, about the way he had walked past her that morning as if she were simply not there. She had thought about the letter. She had written it 3 nights ago. Actually, before the dinner, before any of this had happened. She had been sitting at her desk late at night when something had come over her, some sudden rush of feeling that she couldn't hold in her chest anymore. She had written to Jack the way you write to someone when you've stopped being able to say things out loud. She had written about Ty, about how some mornings she still reached for him in the dark. She had written about Marion, about how strange it was to love someone you could only remember, never reach. She had written about fear, not the fear of losing the ranch or the money or the land, the deeper fear, the fear of watching the people she loved most slip away from her one by one until she was the last one standing in a place full of beautiful memories and no one left to share them with. She had written, "You are the last piece of a world I can't afford to lose, Jack." And I don't know how to tell you that out loud, so I'm writing it down instead. She had folded the letter and left it on his chair by the fireplace 2 days ago. She still didn't know if he had read it. Now she stood in the barn in the grey pre-dawn quiet, filling the water buckets and trying very hard not to think about anything at all. She moved from stall to stall the way she always did, steady and methodical, letting the work hold her. One of the mares nudged her shoulder as she passed, and Amy pressed her forehead against the horse's face for just a moment and closed her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "I know." She didn't hear him come in. That was the thing that surprised her most later, when she thought back on it. Jack Bartlett's boots on any floor in any building at Heartland had always announced him. She had been hearing that sound her entire life. But this morning he must have moved very slowly, very carefully, because she didn't hear a single footstep. What she heard instead was a soft sound at the barn door, a shift in the air, the particular change in the quality of the silence that happens when a space that was empty is suddenly not empty anymore. Amy turned around. Jack was standing in the doorway. He had his green jacket on. His hat was in his hands rather than on his head, which she noticed immediately because Jack almost never took his hat off outside. The morning light was just beginning to gather behind him, pale and thin, and it outlined him in something that looked almost like silver. He looked old in that light, not in a sad way, in the way that old things are old because they have lasted, because they were built to last. He didn't say anything. Amy didn't say anything either. She stood in the middle of the barn with a water bucket still in her hand and looked at her grandfather across the distance between them. And she felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. It was grief and relief, and love and exhaustion all pressed together into one single feeling that sat right behind her eyes and threatened to become something she couldn't hold back. The silence stretched between them, but this silence was different. She felt it immediately, and she knew he felt it too. Every silence has its own texture if you know how to pay attention. The silences of the past 2 days had been hard and cold and closed, like a door with no handle on her side. But this silence, the one filling the barn right now, was something else entirely. It was the silence of 2 people who had too much to say and didn't know which word should come first. Jack looked down at his hat for a moment. His jaw moved slightly. He was searching for something, the way a man reaches into a deep pocket for a thing he knows is there but can't quite get his hand around. Then he looked up at her and he said it. Your mama would have made the same choice you did. 4 words sitting inside that one sentence. Not I'm sorry. Not you were right. Not I forgive you. Just that. Just the most honest thing he could find inside himself and hand across the distance between them. Amy felt the water bucket slip from her fingers. It hit the barn floor and rolled sideways, but she didn't look at it. She was looking at Jack, and her eyes were burning and her throat had closed up completely, and she could not have spoken in that moment if someone had asked her to, because she understood exactly what he had given her just now. He hadn't just mentioned Marian's name. He hadn't just made a comparison between a mother and her daughter. What Jack had done, in the only language he truly knew how to speak, was tell Amy that he saw her, that he understood why she had done what she did, that her mother's stubbornness and her mother's love and her mother's way of moving through the world had not disappeared when Marian died. It had settled into Amy instead, and Jack, who had loved Marian more fiercely and more quietly than words could hold, was telling Amy that loving her felt the same way. He was telling her she wasn't alone. Amy crossed the barn in about 4 steps and walked straight into him, and Jack's arms came up around her the way they always had, solid and sure, like something that had been waiting in exactly that position for exactly this moment. She pressed her face against his shoulder and the tears came then. Not the sharp, desperate kind, but the slow, deep kind that have been held back for a long time and finally find their way out. Jack didn't say anything else. He just held her, one hand on her back, one hand on the back of her head, the way he used to hold her when she was small and the world had frightened her. His chin rested on top of her head, and he looked out through the open barn door at the morning coming in across the fields of Heartland. Slow and golden and unhurried, outside without either of them noticing at first. The rest of the family had gathered. Lou was standing just beyond the barn door with both hands pressed over her mouth and tears running freely down her face and absolutely no intention of pretending otherwise. Tim was standing a little behind her with his arms crossed and his jaw tight in the particular way Tim held himself when he was feeling something he considered too large for his body. Lisa stood beside Jack with one hand resting gently over her heart, and Lindy, still in her pajamas and her little boots, stood at the very front of all of them with both hands clasped together under her chin, watching her mama and her grandpa Jack with the wide, knowing eyes of a child who understands more than the adults around her realize. Nobody spoke. The morning light moved across the yard and through the barn door and touched everything gently, and then Lindy, in a voice as clear and simple as water, said, "See? I knew Grandpa Jack would come." Lou let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. Tim unfolded his arms and pressed his fist briefly to his mouth. Lisa closed her eyes. Inside the barn, Amy laughed against Jack's shoulder. A real laugh, wet with tears, shaky at the edges, but completely real. And Jack made a sound in his chest that was the closest thing to a laugh that Jack Bartlett ever allowed himself in an emotional moment. A low, quiet rumble that Amy felt more than heard. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. He reached up with one rough old hand and wiped her cheek with his thumb the way he had done when she was a little girl and had come off a horse and was trying very hard not to cry. "We're going to figure out the pasture," he said. "Together. The right way." Amy nodded. She didn't trust her voice yet. "And next time," he said, and there was just the smallest edge of the old Jack in it. The dry, steady Jack who ran this ranch and always would. "You come to me first." "I will," Amy said. He held her gaze for one more moment. And in those sharp blue eyes that had seen 60 years of this land and everyone on it, Amy saw something she hadn't seen in today's. She saw warmth. She saw her grandfather. She saw home. Jack put his hat back on his head, which meant the emotional portion of the morning was officially closed as far as he was concerned, and turned toward the barn door where his family was standing in various states of tearful disarray. He looked at all of them. He looked at Lou's streaming face and Tim's suspiciously red eyes and Lisa's quiet smile and Lindy in her pajama boots. He looked at this family that had survived grief and distance and hard winters and harder silences.